Ancient Greek philosophers from Delos, around 550 BCE through even the Roman period, developed an elaborate theory of what they termed the psyche. The term did not come into popular usage until the German idealist philosopher Christian Wolff used it in his Psychologia Empirica and Psychologia Rationalis, 1732-1734. Until the middle of the 19th century, psychology was widely regarded as a branch of philosophy. Whether it could become an independent scientific discipline was questioned already earlier on. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, declared in his Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, 1786, that psychology might perhaps never become a proper natural science because its phenomena cannot be quantified, among other reasons. Kant proposed an alternative conception of an empirical investigation of human thought, feeling, desire, and action, and lectured on these topics for over 20 years. His Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View in 1798, which resulted from these lectures, looks in many respects very much like an empirical psychology. Johann Friedrich Herbart, who died in 1841, took issue with what he viewed as Kant's conclusion and attempted to develop a mathematical basis for a scientific psychology. Although he was unable to empirically realize the terms of his psychological theory, his efforts did lead scientists such as Ernst Heinrich Weber and Gustav Theodor Fechner to attempt to measure the mathematical relationship between the physical magnitudes of external stimuli and the psychological intensities of the resulting sensations. Fechner, in 1860, is the originator of the term psychophysics. Meanwhile, individual differences in reaction times have become a critical issue in the field of astronomy under the name of the personal equation. Early researches by Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel, who died in 1846 in Königsberg, and Adolf Hirsch led to the development of a highly precise chronoscope by Matthias Hipp that in turn was based on a design by Charles Wheatstone for a device that measured the speed of artillery shells. Other timing instruments were borrowed from physiology and adapted for the use by the Utrecht ophthalmologist Franciscus Donders, who died in 1899, and his student Johann Jacob de Jager in measuring the duration of simple mental decisions. So what I've just went over has to do with the evolution from Greece and through Rome and the different psychologists and the different pamphlets that they wrote and articles, and the conclusions being debated about the scientific basis of psychology, whether it's a valid natural science, and the different Germanic efforts to quantify psychology now and develop a mathematical basis for scientific psychology. Okay. And now we go to the 19th century, was also the period in which physiology, including neurophysiology, professionalized and saw some of its more significant discoveries. Among its leaders were Charles Bayle and Francois Magendie, who independently discovered the distinction between sensory and motor nerves in the spinal column. Johannes Müller, who died in 1855, who proposed the doctrine of specific nerve energies. Emile de Bois-Reymond, who died in 1896, who studied the electrical basis of muscle contraction. Pierre-Paul Broca, who died in 1880, and Karl Vranick, who died in 1905, who identified areas of the brain responsible for different aspects of language, as well as Gustav Fritsch, Edward Hitzig, and David Ferrier, who localized sensory and motor areas of the brain. One of the principal founders of experimental physiology, Hermann von Helmholtz, conducted studies of a wide range of topics that would later be of interest to psychologists: the speed of neurotransmission, the natures of sound and color, and of our perceptions of them. In the 1860s, while he held a position at Heidelberg, Hermann's engaged as an assistant a young MD called Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt employed the equipment of physiology, laboratory, chronoscope, chirograph, and various peripheral devices to address more complicated psychological questions that had until then been investigated experimentally. In particular, he was interested in the nature of Perception. The point at which a perception occupies the central focus of conscious awareness. Now how we're talking about levels of consciousness. When it comes to applying the understanding of levels of consciousness, I pointed out why I'm the expert and they aren't. I'll take a little break here, let you soak this in. I'm talking about neurophysiology and complex stuff like motor functions and the transmission of color and sound in the brain and the how Germans studied this. So a lot of the studies are valid studies based on principles from other sciences, like they're studying artillery shells and astronomy, etc. But as soon as we get into the schools of thoughts applying the valid scientific principles for their own agenda and psychiatry being formed from that's when the problem comes in. In 1874, Wundt took up professorship in Zurich, where he published his landmark textbook, Grundzüge der physiologischen Psychologie, Principles of Physiological Psychology in 1874. Moving to a more prestigious professorship in Leipzig in 1875, Wundt founded a laboratory specifically dedicated to original research in experimental psychology in 1879, the first laboratory of its kind in the world. In 1883, he launched a journal in which to publish the results of his and his students' research. It was called Philosophical Studies, was the title of it in German. Wundt attracted a large number of students not only from Germany but also from abroad. Among his most influential American students were G. Stanley Hall, James McKean Cato, and Frank Angell. The most influential British student was Edward Bradford Titchener, who later became a professor at Cornell. Experimental psychology laboratories were soon also established at Berlin by Karl Stumpf and at Göttingen by George Elias Müller, another major German experimental psychologist of the era. Though he did not direct his own research institute, you also had Hermann Ebbinghaus. Experimentation was not the only approach to psychology in the German-speaking world at this time. Starting in the 1980s, employing the case study technique, the Viennese physician Sigmund Freud developed and applied the method of hypnosis, free association, and dream interpretation to reveal putatively unconscious beliefs and desires that he argued were the underlying cause of his patient's hysteria. He dubbed this approach psychoanalysis. Freudian psychoanalysis is particularly notable for the emphasis it places on the course of an individual's sexual development in pathogenesis. Psychoanalytic concepts have had a strong and lasting influence on Western cultures, particularly on the arts. Although its scientific contribution is still a matter of debate, both Freudian and Jungian psychology revealed the existence of compartmentalized thinking, in which some behavior and thoughts revealed the existence of in which some behavior and thoughts are hidden from consciousness, yet operative as part of the complete personality. Hidden agendas, a bad consciousness, or a sense of guilt are example of the existence of mental processes in which the individual is not conscious through choice of lack of understanding of some aspects of the personality and subsequent behavior. Psychoanalysis examines mental processes which affect the ego, and understanding of these theoretically allow the individual greater choice and consciousness, with a healing effect in neurosis and occasionally in psychosis, both of which Richard von Krafft-Ebing defined as diseases of the personality. Carl G. Jung was an associate of Freud's, whose unconscious first noted who later broke with him during Freud's emphasis on sexuality, working with the concepts of the unconscious, first noted during the 1800s by John Stuart Mill, Krafft-Ebing, Pierre Janet, Theodore Florini, and others. Jung identified 4 mental functions which relate to and define the ego, the conscious self, sensation, feelings, intellect, and intuition. 1890s, Freud, Jung, and compartmentalized thinking. In 1892, G. Stanley Hall invited 30-some psychologists and philosophers to a meeting at Clark with the purpose of founding a new American Psychological Association, APA. On the history of the APA, you can see more about Evans, etc. The first annual meeting of the APA was held later that year, hosted by George Stewart Fullerton at the University of Pennsylvania. Almost immediately, tensions arose between the experimentally and philosophically inclined members of the APA. Edward Bradford Titchener and Lytner Whitmer launched an attempt to either establish a separate section for philosophical presentations or to reject the philosophers altogether. After nearly a decade of debate, a Western Philosophical Association was founded and held its first meeting in 1901 at the University of Nebraska. The following year, 1902, an American Philosophical Association held its first meeting at Columbia University. These ultimately became the central and eastern divisions of the modern American Philosophical Association. Going on. With his collaborator Theodore Simon, he developed the Binet-Simon intelligence test, first published in 1905. Of course, that's Binet in collaboration with Simon. Although the test was used to effect in France, it would find its greatest success in the United States, where it was translated in by Henry H. Goddard, the director of the training school for the feeble-minded in Vineland, New Jersey, and his assistant Elizabeth Kite. The translation test was used by Goddard to advance his eugenics agenda with respect to those he deemed congenitally feeble-minded, especially immigrants from non-Western European countries. Binet's test was revised by Stanford professor Louis M. Terman into the Stanford Binet IQ test in 1916. With Binet's death in 1911, the Sorbonne Laboratory and L'Année Psychologique fell to Henri Perron. Perron's orientation was more physiological than Binet's had been. Now we talk about the Wurzburg School. In 1896, one of Wundt's former Leipzig laboratory assistants, Oswald Kolb, founded a new laboratory in Wurzburg. Kolb soon surrounded himself with a number of younger psychologists, most notably Zari B. H. Ack, Karl Bühler, Ernst Dürer, Karl Marb, and Henry Jackson Watt. Collectively developed a new approach to psychological experimentation that flew in the face of many of Wundt's restrictions. Wundt had drawn a distinction between the old philosophical style of self-observation, in which one introspected for extended durations on higher thought processes and inner perception, in which one could be immediately aware of momentary sensation, feeling, or image. The former was declared to be impossible by Wundt, who argued that higher thought could not be studied experimentally through extended introspection, but only humanistically through folk psychology. On the latter was a proper subject for experimentation. The Wurzburgers, by contrast, designed experiments in which the experimental subject was presented with a complex stimulus, and after processing it for a time, retrospectively reported to the experimenter all that had passed through his consciousness during the interval. In the process, the Wurzburgers claimed to have discovered a number of new elements of consciousness, including conscious sets, awareness, thoughts. In the English language literature, these are often collectively termed imageless thoughts, and the debate between Wundt and the Wurzburgers as the imageless thought controversy. Wundt referred to the Wurzburger studies as sham experiments and criticized them vigorously. Wundt's most significant English student, Edward Bradford Titchener, then working at Cornell, intervened in the dispute, claiming to have conducted extended introspective studies in which he was able to resolve the Wurzburgers' imageless thoughts into sensations, feelings, and images. He thus paradoxically used a method of which Wundt did not approve in order to affirm Wundt's view of the situation. The imageless thought debate is often said to have been instrumental in undermining the legitimacy